Now for me, the most important question in life is not what the world is made of. And in fact, I would say that's a relatively new preoccupation of humankind. You know, we didn't really formalize, you could say that the ancient Greeks laid the groundwork for the emergence of an empirical science. And then it emerged more formally with Bacon and Descartes and Newton 500-600 years ago. Not very long, like a blink of the eye in human terms. Before that, people were engineers, they could build things and so forth, but they didn't know how to, they weren't scientists. They didn't really conceptualize the world as an objective place. We do that automatically because science has seeped so far into our set of presuppositions. That doesn't make us good scientists, by the way, but it does make us believe that the fundamental reality of the world is an objective reality, and I'm not going to dispute that particularly, but leaves one set of questions unanswered, probably by its nature, because it wasn't designed to answer the question. And that question is, how should one conduct oneself in the world? And that's an important thing, since you're alive, and hypothetically you'd rather stay alive, and while you're alive you probably don't want to suffer any more than you have to, and no more stupidly than you have to, and it might also be good if some of the things that you wanted actually happened, and so you know you're motivated to know how to act, and people are always telling each other how to act. We're sending each other information all the time about how to act. We do that with the expressions on our face, and of course when we talk to people we always look at their face, and that's because their face tells you what they're up to. You know, if they're smiling and paying attention to you, well then you can assume that you're doing something right, and if they're looking annoyed or disgusted, that's a particularly bad one, then you might think, you might take a hint from that, especially if, you know, 3 or 4 people are doing it at the same time. And so we're reflecting some ideal to one another constantly, and the more attentive you are, the more likely you are to act in accordance with that ideal, and the more likely you are to move towards it. You may not even know what the ideal is in an articulated sense. In fact, you probably don't. You know, you could come up with well, you know, a good person is nice and friendly and, you know, cooperative, and yeah, you know, that's all just cliche. But you don't, you know, your conception might be very hollow. It's very likely that it's very hollow, even though you may be able to act in a very sophisticated manner. Alright, so anyways, this is a story. I'd say it's a meta story. It's what would happen if you collected a bunch of stories and then you extracted out a story from them. And it's sort of a story about destiny, and it's couched in a religious language, but that's okay, because most of these distilled stories form the foundation of religious texts, and myths and stories are, as I said, part of the outer perimeter of our society. They have a coherent nature, and they form a foundation, and it's on that foundation that everything that you take for granted rests, even if you don't understand the foundation. So I can give you an example. There's a metaphysical idea that underlies Western civilization, and that metaphysical idea is that the individual has transcendent worth. That's the idea from which the notion of natural rights is derived. And of course our legal system is predicated on the idea that you have certain natural rights. They're enshrined in the Bill of Rights, for example. And in the States, when the Bill of Rights was being formulated, when the original legislation that founded the state was being formulated, the formulators said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What does that mean? They're axioms of faith, right? They're propositions, and there's no proof for them. They're a mode of operation in the world. And so the hypothesis is something like, well, if I treat you like there's something about you that has transcendent value, implicit, intrinsic value, whatever that might be, and there are stories about that and we'll talk about that, and you do the same to me, and then we set up a body of laws that recognizes the sovereignty of the individual, so that the law itself has to act with respect towards every individual, even if that individual has done something reprehensible, which is very weird if you think about it, then our society will work better. And, well, perhaps that's true, but for better or worse, that is what this society is predicated on, and that's a very, 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 very old idea. And it's an idea that people came to with great difficulty, because it was over thousands of years that people learned how to take their little tribal groups, which were always squabbling with one another, right, because they're human beings, they're very violent, and tribal groups are by no means civilized. There's no noble savage like the Europeans thought. If you study tribal groups in the world today, the death rate by violence is unbelievably high. So something unites a tribe within a tribe, it's often kinship, but then tribes come together to form larger civilizations, and they have to determine some sort of meta principle that guides them so that they can cooperate and come together without destroying one another, and they have to extract out a principle by which the society might function, and that has to work. And then as societies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they have to bring more and more of these diverse traditions together and extract out something from them that has power and functional utility and that allows people to unite. And so this is one of the stories that talks about that. It's a story about individual responsibility and what happens when it's not heeded. So, you know, because we could say, you are a social creature, right to the core, and most of your environment is other people, and those other people want something from you, and you want something from them, so you're going to play games with them. You're either going to be good at it or you're going to be bad at it, but you're going to play games with them. And so the game might have rules, really sophisticated rules, in fact, and you'd expect that, because as your behavior more and more approximates an ideal, assuming such a thing exists, then you're more and more sophisticated, and the nature of the ideal is perhaps more and more complex and difficult to understand. You get a hint of this, though. You can get a hint of this because you will see, if you pay attention to your own soul, your psyche, your unconscious, you'll see that there are people that you admire and that there are people that you have contempt for. And it isn't necessarily that you're 100% accurate in your judgment. You know, it's not such a bad idea to criticize your first impressions, but those states exist, and so there's a reason you admire someone, and there's a reason you have contempt for someone. There may be multiple reasons, and that's a hint to your intrinsic value structure. It's a hint about your intrinsic value structure, right? You wouldn't admire someone unless there was something about them that you valued, and perhaps that you would also like to be able to do, and you wouldn't despise someone or have contempt for them if you didn't feel that something they were doing was wrong, and that it would be wrong if you did it too. And so you're bringing to bear on the situation an implicit morality, and you have to do that because, as I said, you can't act without a morality, because if you're going to act, you're going to try to make things better. Otherwise, why bother? And if you're acting to make things better, then some things have to be better and some things have to be worse, and that's a value structure.